So one thing I didn't mention in the announcements is that we printed our bulletins pre-Hurricane Lane. And that with all of that in mind, we're no longer doing the reception of new members today because we didn't know what was going to happen. We canceled that portion of the service and we got ready for whatever was going to happen. And so as we move through the service, I just remind you of that. We're not going to be doing that, but we are going to be receiving new members next week. And so we invite you, if you're interested in joining our church and committing to give yourself through your prayers, your presence, your gifts, your service, your witness here at Kailua United Methodist Church, part of our congregation, then you can join us next week and you can talk to Nisha. Nisha, wave your hand in the air and you can talk to her about getting part of the new member reception next week, and we can bring you into that and connect with you. Well, I'm excited to continue our sermon series, What's Your Story? I've had a lot of opportunities to talk with so many of us about the various stories of our lives, and it has been truly a blessing to me. Last week we talked about this, and we kind of introduced this idea, what's your story? And we talked a lot about Donald Miller's book, Story Brand, that inspired my friend, Reverend Sarah Heath, in writing her book, What's Your Story? Donald Miller talks about that every good story has a hero in it. And that hero has some sort of problem, whether it's an internal problem, an existential problem, or just a problem of good and evil, or a problem outside of oneself. And that each story, that hero encounters a problem and has an ally or a guide along the way, who gives him a plan, who then asks him to act. And that action has good consequences or bad consequences, and those consequences are clear. And then in the end, we all know the story. One does well or one does not. It's been so interesting and fascinating to hear about our stories, and last week we focused on the character of Joseph. And we're going to be focused on Joseph throughout this sermon series and the ways in which he embodies that story brand framework a little bit, but more importantly, how he invites us to see our stories alongside his story. Not that we find ourselves in the exact situations, because I don't know about you, but I was not sold into slavery or servanthood by my brothers, although it felt like I was by my brother at times. When he would tell my parents I didn't do the dishes or I didn't do my chores, I felt like they was reminding them of what it was. We don't have these dramatic experiences like Joseph, but I think all of us have an experience of crisis or trauma in our life. An experience where we find ourselves left in a slump or a ditch, a hard place in our life, where Joseph found himself when he was in that ditch and then sold off into slavery. One of my favorite books to read, I live in a world of children's books right now. I read way more children's books than I do any other book. And one of my favorite ones to read, I think some of you might know it, it's called Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss. Yeah, I'm going to read a line from that. Dr. Seuss says this. He says, "You won't lag behind because you'll have the speed. You'll pass the whole gang and you'll soon take the lead. Wherever you fly, you'll be best of the best. Wherever you go, you will top all the rest, except when you don't, because sometimes you won't. I'm sorry to say, but sadly it's true, that bang-ups and hang-ups can happen to you. You'll get all hung up in a prickly perch and your gang will fly on. You'll be left in a lurch. You'll come down from the lurch with an unpleasant bump, and the chances are then that you'll be in a slump. And when you're in a slump, you're not in for much fun. Unslumping yourself is not easily done." These are profound words that Dr. Seuss teaches our children, right? I don't know, did I say something wrong? No. They're profound words that Dr. Seuss teaches our children. And if you've been to many high school graduations, you might have heard this book referenced. But you know what's interesting is that we were telling our stories. One of the questions we asked in our small group is, tell me about your 17-year-old self. Think about it. Your 17-year-old self. This is probably when perhaps someone taught this book to you. If you're like me, this was read, I think, at my high school graduation. But your 17-year-old self, what were you hoping for? What were you anticipating? My 17-year-old self, I was looking at what was my vocation going to be? Where was I going to go to college? What was I going to study? How was I going to say goodbye to my friends? All of these things. But you know what never came up as a 17-year-old? This passage. I was set at the first part of the passage, which I will fly high and I'll soon take the lead. I'll pass everyone. and the future is a destination to be found. But then you know what happened? Life threw me curveballs. One after another after another. And I don't know about you, but I was left college and post-college somewhat disenfranchised with this hope that I had as an aspiring 17-year-old, that life wasn't going to work out exactly the way I had scripted it. I mean, how were you when you were 17? Did you think life was going to be this scripted out story from point A to point B? Or did you recognize that you were going to have these ups and your downs in your life? I don't know about you, but when I find myself in the slump, I find myself in desperation. Every time, without doubt, I find myself on my knees asking God, why in the world has this happened to me? I guess I'm the only one though, right? We find ourselves, when life hits us with a curveball, wondering why, and yet I think one of the truest statements about our humanity, or our human experience, is that life is full of ups and downs, and this small passage from "Oh, the places you'll go" captures it, but so many other stories that we have do as well. You know, I was in high school, one of the things I was taught to read, I'd become a Christian, and I was with a group of Christians that told me if I prayed enough and I did the right things, good things were going to happen, and I was told to read the book, The Prayer of Jabez. Anyone ever read that book? It's a prayer from the Old Testament, and they said if you read it enough and you asked God for what you wanted in your heart's intention, it would come true. That God would grant you your heart's desires, because that's what God did. And I was left believing that if I did the right things, God would give me good things in my life. And that is a great story to believe when good things are going your way. But what happens when the bad things come? You see, one of the things I've come to realize is that I do not believe in what is known as the prosperity gospel. It means if you do the right things and say the right prayers and give enough to the church, that good things are going to go your way. I wish I could do that, because we would have no financial troubles as a church institution if that was ever true. But life is full of hang-ups and full of bang-ups. And our question isn't, will it ever happen? It's what will we do when it happens? And where will we find ourselves in the midst of God's unfolding story? You see, because Joseph found himself in this. He found himself in the ditch. And then perhaps he said this prayer. Perhaps he prayed to God in that moment. We're not given a lot about what he is thinking or praying about in those moments. All we know is that all of a sudden God is with him in the story, which I believe God was with him the whole time. But it says God was with him, and he starts to have prominence in this household of the Potiphar's household, this Egyptian official. And just when you think everything is going to go his way after that slump, you know what happens again? Potiphar's wife comes out of him. Potiphar's wife tries to entice him, and then he says no, and then when you think, well, there he is, being faithful, doing the right thing, good things are going to happen to him, he's thrown in prison. And then he's thrown in prison, and he begins to interpret dreams of the baker and the cupbearer, and you begin to think, oh, good things are happening for Joseph, God is on Joseph's side, and then one of them gets to the Pharaoh, and in Pharaoh's court, and doesn't remember Joseph. And Joseph is left in prison again. And so he keeps going through these series of allies and friends, and is up and down, and he finds himself in this roller coaster ride called life. Because as if Dr. Seuss's words weren't right enough that you'll find yourself in a slump and it's going to be hard to get out of that slump, you find yourself in another slump. That just when you take one step forward, you take two steps back. I mean, I don't know about you, over the past week, this has been our story a little bit, hasn't it? Hurricane Lane is Category 5. No, it's going to dissipate. No, it's a Category 4. And it dissipated. And I wish I could say we all said the right prayer. But then I'm reminded of Big Island. And I'm reminded that not always things go well in our stories. But I tell you what, there is this shift in Joseph's language that you notice. Because remember, Joseph was the son of Jacob, who is also known as Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. And Jacob is the son of Isaac, who was the promised child of Abraham and Sarah, through whom God was to bless the entire earth. Joseph was to be the blessing to the entire earth. He knew that. He was Jacob's favorite son. He wore that fancy cloak around and he, flaunted that to his brothers. It was his identity to be a blessing to the world. But then that came crashing down. And you would think that he would want to get that identity back with everything left in him, but his language changes a little bit, and it's really subtle, because all of a sudden, you start to hear this language about God that you never heard before in his story. All of a sudden, you start to hear him say to Potiphar's wife, "I will not sin against God." And then when the cupbearer and the baker come to him, he says, "Isn't it God's interpretation?" And then later on, we'll talk about this next week, when he's brought before Pharaoh, he says, "I don't interpret, but God interprets." And over again, now all of a sudden, God is taking this role in his life, and it's not one that we would anticipate of dictating what he's to do, but it's one where he's journeying with God as a mentor, an ally in his life. One of my favorite sections of Scripture is called wisdom literature. We'll do an entire sermon series on it sometime, a Bible study, because I love it so much. And wisdom literature is from the Old Testament. And it refers to the books of Proverbs, of Job, if you've ever read the story of Job, the Psalter, the book of the Psalms, Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs, and Lamentations. And you might be wondering what all of them have in common, and you might also know Proverbs as one of those quintessential quid pro quo. If you do the right things, God's going to bless you with these sorts of things. But you know what all of the wisdom literature has in common? This word, the fear of God. And what does the fear of God mean? I mean, we interpret it as like something about Halloween, you be afraid of God, and it makes no sense to us. But if you read the wisdom literature through and through, the fear of God comes through, and what the fear of God means in Hebrew, poetic, and wisdom literature is to recognize our reliance on God. To recognize that God is journeying with us. The book of Ecclesiastes says there's a time for this and there's a time for that. A time for mourning, a time for dancing, a time for the sun to come up and a time for the sun to go down. And God is with you as our guide and our mentor, as our ally. We look at the book of Proverbs as do this and good things happen, and do this and bad things happen, but we forget that the entire book of Proverbs is surrounded by this character, Sophia, Lady Wisdom, who speaks to us God's words subtly and softly, and we're to listen and bend our ear and hear God speaking. We look at the book of the Psalms. And if you think about life's ups and downs, you just have to read the Psalms one a day. Because some days you'll be rejoicing on the mountaintops, and some days you'll be weeping, and some days you'll be left thinking, how did this end up in the Bible after all? God is with us in our story. But do we recognize it? Do we recognize that God is with us, or are we looking up to God, praying that God would save us or change our future or do something miraculous? I grew up watching The Simpsons. Anyone else watch The Simpsons? Yeah. Some of you I know, it's dating me a little bit as a millennial. But I grew up watching The Simpsons, and there's this great scene where Bart Simpson, he's one of the main characters, he had this test coming up the next day. And he had this test coming up that he did not prepare for at all. And so that night, if you know Bart Simpson, he was anything but religious. He was the troublemaker in Sunday school class, and he was the one that was kicked out of the sanctuary during worship. And Bart found himself praying right before that test. God, save me from this test. And then, of course, it was a snow day the next day, right? Bart ended up having to take that test. ended up squandering his entire snow day, not with studying as an opportunity to learn, but instead to play, and then found himself left in the same situation. But I wonder sometimes, do we look at God as that sort of a God where we kneel by our bedside and pray for God to change our circumstances? Or do we look to God like Lady Sophia whispering words of wisdom in our ear amidst our life's ups and especially our life's downs? Do we find ourselves like the biblical character of Joseph, where God is with Joseph in the present? That the future is unknown, that life has been full of tragedy and joy, and God is with us always in those moments. One of the most profound questions we asked our small groups last week is, do you see your story as a unique, unfolding story of God's love? And I would add to that today by saying, do you see that story full of life's ups and life's downs as a story of your guide and your mentor and your maker and your God with you? With you in life's ups and life's downs. Do you see God with you during those moments when you want to celebrate on the mountaintop or cry in the chapel of the hospital, whispering words to us? Because I tell you one thing, I believe God is always with us. I don't believe that God has predestined our life for good, unfortunately, or for bad. But I know that God is there revealing God's truth, journeying and writing our story. Can we proclaim it? And do we believe it? That God's revealing something good through you. As the worship team comes forward, I'm going to offer a prayer. Gracious God, you reveal your love through the stories of the Bible, working in people's lives as they listen to you and follow your trajectory or where you would guide them. Help us find ourselves alongside the biblical characters like Joseph, like Mary Magdalene, the disciples. And help us recognize that you are always with us and always revealing yourself to us and revealing yourself to the world through the stories that we will tell. Amen.